From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Claire Messud wrote one of my favorite novels last year. But there's nothing surprising in that, because whenever she writes a book, it's one of my favorites of the year. Although she lives in Cambridge, Mass. now, we used to have her closer at hand. She's taught creative writing at the University of Maryland and Johns Hopkins. She began her career as a novelist in 1995 with a book called When the World Was Steady, which was a finalist for the Faulkner Award. And she was a finalist for the Faulkner again in 2002 for The Hunters. She won both critical and popular praise in 2006 for another fantastic novel called The Emperor's Children, which was longlisted for the Man Booker Prize. The Emperor's Children was a brilliant New York satire about three clever friends from Brown University who are beginning to realize that despite all their advantages, they're floundering at life. And last year she published The Woman Upstairs, a trim, ferocious novel about a 42-year-old schoolteacher who's single, childless, and sick of being ignored. How angry am I? The novel begins. You don't want to know. But you do want to know. We're not the mad woman in the attic. They get lots of play, one way or another, she says. We're the quiet woman at the end of the third-floor hallway, whose trash is always tidy, who smiles brightly in the stairwell with a cheerful greeting, and who, from behind closed doors, never makes a sound. In our lives of quiet desperation, the woman upstairs is who we are, without a goddamn tabby or a pesky lolloping Labrador, and not a soul registers that we are furious. We're completely invisible. The Woman Upstairs is a piercing assessment of the way young women are acculturated and the way older women are trapped. Male or female, you'll feel your own shameful anxieties and fragile hopes being flayed by the braided strands of confession and rage in this novel, which the Washington Post chose as one of the best 5 novels of the year. Claire Messud will be available to sign copies of her book at 2 o'clock. Please join me in welcoming her here today.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you all for coming. It's wonderful to be here. This room is weirdly big. It's just huge. I thought what I might do today is talk you a little bit about Nora Eldridge, who's the protagonist of The Woman Upstairs, and read you a little bit here and there, but mostly. You know, when you write a book, people say, what did you think you were doing? And of course, when you were doing it, you weren't really thinking about it. You were just kind of doing it. And then afterwards, you have to make up a story about why you made up the story. So I've made up, you know, a little bit of a story about why I made up the story. And I thought I would tell you that story and see if you believe it. I don't know, we'll give it a go. Anyway, so just Nora Eldridge, she is, when she tells the story, she's 42. The story that she's telling takes place largely in her 37th year. And she's an elementary school teacher in Cambridge, Massachusetts, who has spent the past few years nursing her mother, who had a degenerative neurological illness to her death. So the loss of her mother is not far behind her, which for me at least is an important part of who she is in this time. And in her late 30s, without even, because, well, I'll come to the, no, maybe I should start there. Okay, I'll start there. I'll come to the anger in a minute. We're gonna get back to the anger, but I'll start by saying, this is a book I couldn't have written any earlier. It's a book about the middle of your life. And we are in this society, in this time, immensely privileged to have a very long youth in a way that I think is unprecedented in the history of humanity, so that we can think of ourselves as young for a very long time. That means that we can think of ourselves essentially as still college kids when we're 30, and maybe college kids when we're 80, which is great. But for most of us, at some point along the line comes the realization that it's not going to go on forever, and that maybe you're not so young anymore, and that all the things you thought were ahead of you are maybe not all there. You know, I always thought I was going to be well-groomed when I grew up. I was like, oh, when I grow up, like, oh, you're over 40. It's not happening, you know. I am never going to blow dry my hair. I just don't know how. There are certain things you think will come someday, and they don't come. But sometimes you go a long way without realizing it, and then sometimes other people realize it before you. There's a wonderful but very painful thing you may remember in Tolstoy's Anna Karenina about Karenin, her husband, whom she leaves. But at one point Tolstoy says he had passed the peak of his career and he was the only one who didn't know it. And I feel as though we all feel about that, about something along the way, like is the best back there. Anyway, but in the novel, Nora cites the Marianne Faithfull song, "The Ballad of Lucy Jordan," which I don't know if you are familiar with, but the lyrics, the little bit that she quotes, the lyrics go like this, and I can't sing, I'm sorry. At the age of 37, she realized she'd never ride through Paris in a sports car with the warm wind in her hair. And for Nora, the thing that's sort of strange is that she has almost the opposite of a Lucy Jordan moment, which is to say she's settled into her life in Cambridge, and it's a good life. It's a safe life. It isn't the life she dreamed of. She dreamed of being an artist. She dreamed of having children. She has her classroom full of children. She makes art in her apartment on the weekends, and she sort of let go without realizing it of some of the dreams of her youth. And then this family comes to town, the Shahid family, and the little boy is in her class, and the father is an academic who's on a fellowship at Harvard, and the mother is an artist. And so at the age of 37, she suddenly, by spending time with them, she shares a studio with Sirena, who's the mother of that household, the mother and wife, the artist. Okay, how about that I start with mother and wife, eh? And she really feels that actually she is on the cusp of riding through Paris in a sports car with the warm wind in her hair. Like, it's here. She hadn't realized it. And the anger that she feels is related to how much she feels is at stake and what she's worried about losing when eventually the Shahid family goes home, because that's the Shahid family's in Cambridge, Massachusetts for a year, and then they're going back to their regular lives, and she's not invited to go with them. So, so let me read just a little of that from the beginning that Ron quoted from, and how angry am I? You don't want to know. Nobody wants to know about that. I'm a good girl, I'm a nice girl, I'm a straight A, straight-laced, good daughter, good career girl, and I never stole anybody's boyfriend, and I never ran out on a girlfriend, and I put up with my parents' shit and my brother's shit, and I'm not a girl anyhow. I'm over 40 fucking years old, and I'm good at my job, and I'm great with kids, and I held my mother's hand when she died after 4 years of holding her hand while she was dying. And I speak to my father every day on the telephone, every day, mind you. And what kind of weather do you have on your side of the river? Because here it's pretty gray and a bit muggy too. It was supposed to say great artist on my tombstone, but if I died right now, it would say such a good teacher, daughter, friend instead. And what I really want to shout, and want in big letters on that grave too, is fuck you all. I'm sorry, I apologize. Don't all women feel the same? The only difference is how much we know we feel it, how in touch we are with our fury. We're all furies except the ones who are too damn foolish, and my worry now is that we're brainwashing them from the cradle, and in the end, even the ones who are smart will be too damn foolish. What do I mean? I mean the second graders at Appleton Elementary, sometimes the first graders even, and by the time they get to my classroom to the third grade, they're well and truly gone. They're full of Lady Gaga and Katy Perry and French manicures and cute outfits, and they care how their hair looks in the third grade. They care more about their hair or their shoes than about galaxies or caterpillars or hieroglyphics. How did all that revolutionary talk of the 70s land us in a place where being female means playing dumb and looking good? Even worse on your tombstone than dutiful daughter is looked good. Everyone used to know that, but we're lost in a world of appearances now. That's why I'm so angry, really. Not because of all the chores and all the making nice and all the duty of being a woman, or rather of being me, because maybe these are the burdens of being human. Really, I'm angry because I've tried so hard to get out of the hall of mirrors, this sham and pretend of the world, or of my world, on the east coast of the United States of America in the first decade of the 21st century. And behind every mirror is another fucking mirror, and down every corridor is another corridor, and the fun house isn't fun anymore, and it isn't even funny, but there doesn't seem to be a door marked exit. At the fair each summer when I was a kid, we visited the fun house with its creepy, grinning plaster face 2 stories high. You walked in through its mouth, between its giant teeth, along its hot pink tongue. Just from that face, you should have known. It was supposed to be a lark, but it was terrifying. The floors buckled or they lurched from side to side, and the walls were crooked and the rooms were painted to confuse perspective. Lights flashed, horns blared, and the narrow, vibrating hallways lined with fattening mirrors and elongating mirrors and inside-out, upside-down mirrors. Sometimes the ceiling fell or the floor rose or both happened at once, and I thought I'd be squashed like a bug. The fun house was scarier by far than the haunted house, not least because I was supposed to enjoy it. I just wanted to find the way out. But the doors marked exit led only to further crazy rooms, to endless moving corridors. There was one route through the funhouse, relentless to the very end. I've finally come to understand that life itself is the funhouse. All you want is that door marked exit, the escape to a place where real life will be, and you can never find it. No, let me correct that. In recent years, there was a door, there were doors, and I took them, and I believed in them, and I believed for a stretch that I'd managed to get out into reality. And God, the bliss and terror of that, the intensity of that, it felt so different. Until I suddenly realized I'd been stuck in the funhouse all along. I'd been tricked. The door marked exit hadn't been an exit at all. Just a little moment about the anger. She's a little crabby. I feel like if people know anything about Nora Eldridge without reading the book, they know she's crabby. And I have to say, for me, that was one of the starting points for the book. The first thing I wrote was this sort of rant that opens the book, and then I had to figure out who was yelling in my ear and why. But the truth is that I personally have always had a ranter, loved a ranter. And you know, I don't think that's a universal sentiment. But I do love a ranter. I feel I have a high tolerance for dysfunction. I remember in high school, my senior year in high school, I had a wonderful English teacher who must have had a great deal of leeway with the syllabus, and she gave us to read a list of books, each one of which was like a firework going off in my head. And one of them was 100 Years of Solitude, and another was Walker Percy's The Moviegoer, and To the Lighthouse, Hamlet, but also The Death of Ivan Ilyich, and crucially Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground. And when I read Notes from Underground in my senior year in high school, I couldn't believe that this could be fiction too, that this was allowable too, that you could make a story out of all the most unseemly bits of what it was to be a person, all the unattractive stuff that your mother was always saying, don't say that, don't think that, how dare you, you know? And I loved it. And I realized over time that I sort of gravitated, not solely, I read a lot of stuff, but that I had a whole little treasured canon of grumpy narrators, or crazy grumpy narrators, who I particularly loved. And you know, on the cheerier side, there's somebody like Italo Svevo's Confessions of Zeno, and Zeno is a cheerful ranter in his way, but he's a ranter. There's Beckett's Crap's Last Tape. There's Philip Roth's Mickey Sabbath in Sabbath's Theater. Very disagreeable man. And then one of my favorites, I mean, just because you get a lot of grumpy mileage, is there's a crabby dead Austrian named Thomas Bernhardt, who was both a playwright and a novelist, and his novels are essentially monologues of grumpy people saying, sort of ranting, saying, I hate the weather in Austria, I hate the food here, I hate the inns are dirty, I hate the trains, I hate the country, I hate the city, right? I hate being with people, I hate being by myself. And I actually found it really funny, but there aren't a lot of girl ranters, right? I couldn't find the girls, so at some point I felt like it's time. I got to make one up. So that was part of what was on the cards. Was feeling I was giving voice to something that was familiar to me and important to me, and that I wasn't hearing in the world. And when I was still working on this, my family spent a year in Germany at an institute called the Wissenschaftskolleg, which is an amazing thing that loosely translates as the Knowledge College. And and there was a Dutch anthropologist who came up to me after I gave a reading from the beginning, and he said, "I'm so glad you read that." He was a fairly stern gentleman in his probably mid-60s, and he said, "I'm so glad you read that." He said, "Because growing up, I never saw my mother angry, but I want to tell you a story." He said, on Saturdays, we would all have breakfast, and then she would go upstairs to clean the house. And my father and brothers and sisters, we would stay in the kitchen around the table, and upstairs we would hear her while she was sweeping and changing the sheets and cleaning the bathrooms, and she was cursing at the top of her lungs the entire time. And then she would come downstairs smiling, and we would pretend we hadn't heard, and she would pretend she hadn't cursed, and we would just go on with our lives. And I feel as though, Nora, okay, I always feel sad for her. There are people who think she's not likable. But I want to say, if you met her, she would seem incredibly likable. That's the point. This is the cursing she does upstairs, as it were. This is the cursing she does when everybody's in another room. And I actually, maybe I'm wrong, but I believe that each of us has a little cursing that we do at some point. So I wanted her to come out of the closet as an angry person. Thanks. So, I think there are two more things that were sort of key for me, I think, in setting out to write this book, and one of them, it's a book about somebody who wants to be an artist and her friendship with somebody who is an artist, and there's really a big question in my mind about what the difference is between somebody who wants to be an artist and somebody who is an artist. What makes you an artist? Nora makes art. So is she not an artist because she doesn't have a gallery? Is she not an artist because people don't pay attention to her? Is there some... because I actually think if we took a poll of everybody in this room, almost everybody has some creative work or life that we do, whether it's knitting or being a chef or building boats or painting pictures or writing novels. Each of us has a creative, artistic side, and what makes the world value some creativity more than others. So I think, and how is it different? This book is partly exploring for me how might it be different for girls and women than for boys and men. And it seems to me that there are differences that start very early in our acculturation. And it was my husband who pointed out, we have a daughter and a son, that when our son went to kindergarten. He's the younger one, but when he went to kindergarten, the way the boys interact in kindergarten before school starts is, it's like going to the office. They come in and they hang up their little jacket, and then they say, hey, Tom, hey, Jack, hey, Bob. They go in the corner and they build a train set, or they build a Lego tower, or they take apart a radio, and one person may join them or not join them, but they're just doing that, and there might be a few words, but there isn't essentially conversation. But then in the middle of the kindergarten classroom, there's a big long table with lots of pieces of paper and big jugs of markers. And the girls go to the table and they draw and they chat in the time before school starts. And they say things like, wow, is that a flower? Why are you using brown? I don't know any brown flowers. Is your flower dead? Or they say, wow, you can really draw a fish well, like maybe you're a better fish drawer than I am. And then they all say things like, those are new pants. Where did you get those pants? You didn't have those pants before. And it goes all the way through life, that responsibility to sit at the table. As a mom, I'm a mom. Now, you go to the school gate and people are waiting, and the kids are big now, so it happens less, but there'd always be like, is that Mary over there? I think that's the first time I've seen her at pickup all term. She never comes. She sends a babysitter. I don't think she brought anything for the potluck either. You know what? Maybe she didn't even show up, right? And there is some sort of cultural responsibility to engage. We don't have a myth there's no like female Steve Jobs. There's no female semi-autistic genius who we think it's perfectly okay that she says, you're gonna stay here till 4 a.m. until you get it right? Who makes you cry, and then after you say, but she's such a genius, it's just such a joy to work for her. No, that woman is a hysterical nightmare, and she gets sacked, right? It's a whole different set of priorities. And if you think about making art, which is somebody standing up and saying, I know you think I should earn a living and be a productive member of society, but what I think I'm gonna do is sit in my room and just like make some stuff for a couple of years, and afterwards you'll be really glad. And it's hard for anybody. That's kind of a tough call for anybody. But I feel as though for the girls, it's somehow a little bit tougher, because there's some moment when all the girls at the drawing table or at the jungle gym or at the school gate are saying, who does she think she is anyway? Well, she thinks she doesn't have to bring muffins for the teacher appreciation breakfast? I have better things to do, and I bring muffins, right? So I remember Alice Munro saying, my husband interviewed her years ago, and I drove the car, so I got to hear a little of what she had to say. And I remember her talking about her youth in the late 50s and early 60s in Western Canada. And she was living in Vancouver, and she said, at that time, women were supposed to look as though they did nothing, but their houses were supposed to be impeccably clean, and you were always supposed to have coffee on the go, so that if a neighbor popped by, you'd say, oh, there's just some coffee perking. And so the only way she could find to write was to say that she was sick and retreat behind her bedroom door. And at school, one of her daughters was asked, what do your parents do? And her daughter, Mummy is sick and rests, right? So I feel like you gotta find a way to do it. And if you don't find a way, right? If you don't find a way, you don't do it. So I'm talking too much. Okay. It's okay. We'll just stay till 4. Yeah. I'm gonna read a little bit more, and then I have one last little thing. Okay, and then we can have some questions. From the beginning, then. No, let's not start from the beginning. That's too long. So, from our ordinary family in our ordinary house, a center entrance colonial with its potted geraniums on the stone porch and its charmingly untended yew hedges nibbling at the windows, I made my way out into the ordinary world, to the local elementary school, the local middle school, the local high school. I was popular enough, universally liked by the girls, even liked when noticed by the boys, though not in a romantic way. I was funny, not peculiar. It was a modest currency like pennies, pedestrian, somewhat laborious, but a currency nonetheless. I was funny in public, most often at my own expense. Education was different then, and I was good at it, and so I skipped grade 9, went straight from 8 to 10, which was socially a little tough at first and sealed my fate as a disastrous math student. I never learned the quadratic formula and other important tips from 9th grade math, just like I missed the early dating essays and the classes in how to navigate a school dance. At the time, though, I wasn't embarrassed about any of this, not embarrassed to be thrown sink or swim into the second year of high school without so much as a map to the cafeteria or a primer on how cliques were lined up, or even a list of the names of my new classmates, all of whom knew one another and some of whom knew me as their little sister's friend. No, I was proud because I knew my parents were proud, because it was an elevation and a revelation of the fact that I was special. I had long suspected it, and now I knew for sure I was destined. When you're a girl, you never let on that you are proud or that you know you're better at history or biology or French than the girl who sits beside you and is 18 months older. Instead, you gush about how good she is at putting on nail polish or at talking to boys, and you roll your eyes at the vaunted difficulty of the history, biology, French test and say, "Oh my God, it's going to be such a disaster. I am so scared." And you put yourself down whenever you can so that people won't feel threatened by you, so they'll like you, because you wouldn't want them to know that in your heart you are proud and maybe even haughty and are riven by thoughts the revelation of which would show everyone how deeply not nice you are. You learn a whole other polite way of speaking to the people who mustn't see you clearly, and you get told by others that they think you're really sweet, and you feel a thrill of triumph. Yes, I'm good at history, biology, French, and I'm good at this too. It doesn't even occur to you as you fashion your mask so carefully that it will grow into your skin and graft itself, come to seem irremovable. When you look at the boy, Josh, who skipped the grade alongside you, and you see him wiping his nose upon his sleeve, and note his physical scrawniness, his chin's bloom of acne next to the other 10th grade boys with broader chests and clear square jaws, when you observe that he still takes his lunch with his old 9th grade friends, all of them boys in black t-shirts with glitter decals across the breast that say KISS or AC/DC, all of them with pimply chins and wet lips and hair as lank as seaweed, you cannot see any triumph in him at all. He seems clearly to have lost, to be a loser, because anybody knows that in the challenge you were given when you skipped a grade, social success, modest social success to be sure, but still, was half the battle. When Frederica Beatty invites you to join her birthday party, a sail on her father's boat with 6 other girls, 2 of whom are from the most popular set, you feel pity for Josh, who will never taste such nectar. But wait, nobody ever pointed out that Josh, in his obliviousness, was utterly happy. He'd already taught himself the quadratic formula. He would not be stymied in any area of academic advancement. In fact, he would go on to MIT and eventually become a neurobiologist with a lab largely funded by the NIH and a vast budget at his disposal. He would marry a perfectly attractive, if rather knock-kneed woman and spawn several knock-kneed bespectacled nerds, replicas of himself. It will all work out more than fine for him, and he will never for a second suspect that it could have been otherwise. He will not know there was a social test. He will not know that he failed it. No, a sail on Frederica Beatty's father's boat was an honor that he dreamed not of, and his yen for society, such as it was perfectly satisfied by his old clan now a year behind him. He could no more have fashioned a mask than flown to the moon, and so he remained who he was forevermore, femininity as masquerade, indeed. Thank you. So I will in one moment stop talking, but I do just want to get in the fourth and last thing in my post facto story of what I was trying to write about in this book, and that is the interior life. And I think that's one thing that whatever I write, I'm always trying to write about, because so much. Well, as the epigraph to my last novel was from Anthony Pohl, from his Dance to the Music of Time, and it's I mangle the quote, but basically it's saying it's not what happens, it's what you think happens that matters, and so much of our lives never breaks the surface. So much of what's most important to us nobody knows about. There's a wonderful moment in Chekhov's Lady with the Little Dog, where Gurov, who's a man in his 40s, who's had many affairs, he's married with children, he's had many affairs, he falls in love with this woman, and at one point he's walking his son to school, and he thinks he thinks of himself as really in love for the first time, and he's walking his son, I think his daughter, son, child, to school, and he thinks, how can it be that the thing that matters most to me in the world nobody knows about? And then he thinks, but that's true for everybody. And is true for all of us. The little happy things that happen in a day, when somebody says something nice to you, or you learn something wonderful, or you see a beautiful flower and you would never bother to tell anyone. Well, Proust wrote all that down. If you read Remembrance of Things Past, there's a wonderful detail in that great vast tome where he says, you know how it is when something good happens and you don't have time to sort of dwell on it, and like a candy, you hold it to you and take it home, and every so often you think, there's something good, oh, I'll get back to that later, right? And I feel like that's something you would never bother saying to a friend, but there it is, somebody wrote it down. And that's what it seems to me is one of the great gifts of fiction, obviously, in some great way to experience other lives and to feel less alone on the planet, but also to share experiences that otherwise are never shared for one reason or another. So I think that's one of the reasons I love to read, and it's one of the things that I'm always trying to write about, is just what it's like to be alive. Oh, how's that for trite? Let's stop there. Thank you. And I think there's a little time for some questions, if anybody has one.
Back here. Is Nora in love with all three of the family members?
Yes.
And it's hard to determine which one is more. And was there a lesbian relationship she felt for the mom?
Well, I think yes and no. I think one of the things very troublingly, I have a little thing, it's actually, for some reason I have it all copied out here. She writes at one point, if they were a meal, I would have eaten all the courses with equal relish. This is the family. Each so distinct and so uniquely flavorful. I had no way to conceive of them all together. I have to be clear about this, because otherwise you might think I was fond of a family, that their familyness was a pleasure to me. But then she goes on to say, I was in love with Reza, that's the boy. I was in love with Serena, I was in love with Skandar. All these things were true, they were not mutually exclusive, but they also, most important, did not, as far as I could see, pertain to one another. And troublingly, from that, I've had people say, well, the pedophile element of the book, and when she's in love with Reza, it is absolutely not, certainly in my mind, there is no pedophile component. One of the things that I feel unsettled by is how highly sexualized love is in this time. And that we live in a culture that wants always to put a sexual component into any passionate feelings. It's one of the things when you read novels about 19th century gay characters who never acted on their desires, and I think it's actually very difficult in retrospect to know to what unless they left writings about it, to know to what extent feelings were articulated, or what sort of feelings were articulated. And again, in the 19th century, for example, passionate friendships between women that were not physical were absolutely the norm and very acceptable, socially acceptable. So is there a lesbian component? Yes, in the sense that she's passionately in love with Serena. Is it something that she would lead to a lesbian affair? I feel in the novel there's a moment where she thinks, yes, I would, right? And that's for her when things change. But there's a long time beforehand where she thinks of it as being like a 12-year-old. That actually what she feels for her is when you're a 12-year-old girl and you can't wait to see your best friend.
You deliberately took it to the edge.
Yes.
And left it suspended.
Yes. Because I think often, I think one of the things we want to put, there's also, sorry for those who haven't read it, but there's some stuff with Skandar that goes on, and I felt like I wanted. My editor said, "This is you're making it confused. Like, what exactly goes on?" And I said, "But I want it to be confused, because I actually think if somebody comes to you and says, 'I spent the night with so and so,' well, we all infer certain things, but we don't actually know. Maybe people stayed up till 5 a.m. drinking tea and talking about Descartes, and maybe that was, far more intimate than a one-night stand might have been." I feel as though we actually we have a desire to sort of make simple markers and reduce things that are complicated.
Hi, I really loved your book, and I loved it so much that I went and got the book on tape and listened to it on a road trip. And I've always been curious with authors. By the way, the woman was fantastic.
I've heard that.
Oh my gosh, she was wonderful. Do you have any input into who reads your books?
No.
And that sort of thing? Because I also read another one of your books, which I thought was great, and the actress was not as good, and it made a whole bit of difference to my enjoyment of the book.
Right, that's so interesting. Nobody, certainly in my case, nobody has ever asked me my opinion about who would do the audio book. I do know, I've been talking about being a mom. We have Roald Dahl reading Fantastic Mr. Fox, and it's pretty great tape. I recommend it. I feel like he does it. Nobody else could do it like he does, because he heard the sentences in his head before he wrote them down. So it may be that I think sometimes there are authors who really do want to read their work, and I think sometimes there are people who just make good choices. I don't know, but that's wonderful to know that. Thank you.
Hi, Claire. I finished reading the book about 2 weeks ago, and I absolutely loved it, especially because it articulates the rage so incredibly well. And I think it's rage that is, as you said, very specific in a way to the female, and perhaps the female at a particular age. But what was so interesting for me is that I had a discussion with my mother, who is a big reader and who had also read it. And she felt very differently about the book than I did. So your story about the woman cleaning upstairs, cursing, resonated. And I wondered whether you believe that is the expression of this rage a generational thing? Did it not exist 50 years ago, 60 years ago, for certain women because they weren't raised to feel that they could have everything, that they could have lives that were extraordinary? Or was it always there, it just wasn't voiced in the way that it might be now?
It's a really interesting question. I feel as though we should have a multi-generational panel, discuss it, because I don't really know the answer. But what I do know is that this book has been a fascinating one for me, because the reception, the way readers have felt about it, runs the entire gamut. And I was very early on, I was at a gathering of booksellers in Boston, and one woman came over to me and said, "You have written my story. I'm a fiction writer, but I actually, run a bookstore, and I feel as though you're telling the story of my frustrations." And then another woman who ran another bookstore somewhere else came over and said, "I cannot believe you've wasted space on this loser. I wouldn't want to read it. I wouldn't tell my daughter to read it. I don't know who you think is going to read this book." And I wanted to say, you guys need to chat. So, but what I hope at least is that I put out a voice that can promote or provoke or introduce discussion for everybody, and that different versions and different experiences can be expressed.
It certainly does that. Thank you.
Thank you. I think time for one last. Oh.
Yes. Would you discuss the extent to which you experience the artist versus wannabe artist? In other words, did you struggle to become a writer, to accept yourself as a writer, to present yourself as a writer, to risk being a writer?
I have to say, personally, no. I mean, I struggled to become a writer, but I decided when I was a kid that that's what I wanted to do, and I was sort of a little stubborn, and nobody could really change my mind. And there was a moment when I was a teenager when my father, in the most loving way possible, said, Clary, I have to tell you, only geniuses can be writers, and frankly, Claire, and I am here to tell you, you do not have to be a genius to be a writer. I just want to put that out there for any of you who are worried that that's the constraint. So I felt that for me, that choice, but I think, I also am aware, talking about the interior life, that it's a craziness, right? And just quickly, I have 2 minutes maybe, I carried around for a long time a very slim Schopenhauer book. You don't think of Schopenhauer as slim, but there's a book called Essays and Aphorisms, a little Penguin classic. And I learned from the introduction that he was a man of meticulous habits and rhythms, and he kept everything the same. Anyway, he published The World as Will and Representation in 1818, and nobody paid any attention to it. And it didn't even, I think, really get reviewed. And he said, don't worry, I'll just keep working, they'll come around. And The World as Will and Representation was recognized in 1855. He was still alive to see it, but that's a really long time, 1818 to 1855. And I always think, during those years, what did the neighbors say, right? During those years, did the neighbors say, have you met the genius philosopher who lives down the road? Or did they say, there is a totally insane guy who thinks he's a philosopher who lives down the road? And at some point, it was his own insanity that, or maybe not insanity, maybe sanity, but his own fiction that protected him and enabled him to keep going. And if he waited for the world's approval, it might never have come. And would he be a different guy if it had never come? I don't know. So we could leave it there. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.